physically
A human
weak,
body
just like all humans.
I'm not letting this ship break! This ship break!
Dax Calloway something had gone wrong that morning. Hours before the alarms did a sharp, electric tang of ozone under the usual grease and recycled air. The smell a station gets when something up in the superstructure is arcing where it shouldn't be. He filed it away the way he filed away every wrong smell on Kesh Station, and kept walking, wrench bag slung over one shoulder, boots scuffing along a catwalk grating that had been due for replacement for longer than he'd worked here, past pipe runs he could have mapped blind after 4 years of crawling this station's guts. 6 decks up, in a berth reserved for dignitaries, a Vashtier Royal cruiser sat gleaming and untouched, its hull the deep polished violet of a species that had never once needed to build anything ugly to survive. Dax didn't look at it twice. Royal ships weren't his problem. His problem was Bay 9's coolant manifold, which had been bleeding pressure for 3 shifts running, and a supervisor named Reyes who told him twice already that if he didn't have it fixed by the end of the day, he could explain to Fleet Logistics himself why half the station's secondary reactor was running 12 degrees hot and drawing complaints from every deck downstream of it. He was 38 years old, built more like a man who fixed things than a man who fought things, broad through the shoulders from 20 years of leaning into stuck bolts, hands scarred pale in a dozen places from burns and pinches that had never quite healed clean, a limp in the cold weather from a knee that had taken a bulkhead door the wrong way during a decompression drill gone bad. He'd been a fleet engineer once, second in command of a whole maintenance division on a carrier called the Halcyon that didn't exist anymore in any form he cared to think about. Before a review, board decided the carrier's near-catastrophic hull breach 3 years back had been his fault for improvising a fix instead of waiting on requisitioned parts that would have arrived 2 days too late to matter. The fix had held. The ship had survived that particular crisis, limped home, and been decommissioned 18 months later for reasons that had nothing to do with him at all. The board hadn't cared about any of that, because boards rarely cared about outcomes when procedure had been violated along the way, and Dax had spent the years since bumped down to station-side grunt work, fixing coolant manifolds nobody thanked him for, and answering to supervisors half as competent as he was, in a job that paid less and asked less, and on his better days, let him sleep through the night without dreaming about tearing metal. That suited him fine most days. Most days, nobody expected anything from him at all, and there was a kind of peace in that he'd stopped being embarrassed about needing. He met the princess for the first time at midday, not by invitation, but because Bay 9's coolant line ran directly beneath the dignitary berth's power conduit, and fixing one meant working uncomfortably close to the other. She emerged from her cruiser flanked by 2 armored escorts nearly as tall as the doorway, and even from 30 feet below on the maintenance catwalk, Dax could tell exactly what kind of person she was going to be before she ever opened her mouth. The particular unhurried way she moved, like every door in existence had already decided to open for her before she reached it, like the concept of waiting had simply never applied to her life. HFY K. Lydrin, third daughter of the Vashtier High Court, stood a head taller than any human Dax had ever met, skin the color of polished amethyst, features sharp and symmetrical in the way that species bred for centuries of court politics tended to be. She moved like someone who had never once had to consider whether a floor would hold her weight, whether a door would open for her, whether anyone in any room she entered would fail to notice her arrival. Her voice, when it reached the catwalk below, carried the particular musical lilt of a language built for elegance first and clarity second, every syllable landing with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once needed to raise it to be heard. "That is the maintenance crew," she said to her escort, not lowering her voice at all, the way people rarely bother lowering their voices around workers they've already decided don't count as an audience worth minding. "Humans, I have read reports on your species' physiology. Fragile skeletal structure, absurdly limited tolerance for heat, radiation, vacuum, cold nearly every environment this galaxy has to offer, in fact, save the single narrow band your world happened to evolve within. A human body is weak. She laughed, light and genuinely amused, not cruel exactly, just entirely unbothered by whether the laugh landed on Enio. Ni who might mind it. It astonishes me your species has survived long enough to build stations like this one at all, let alone crewed one competently enough to host a trade summit of this significance. Dax, 30 feet below with a coolant line hissing faint vapor against his wrench, didn't look up. He'd heard worse from people who mattered less, and he'd learned a long time ago that reacting to it never once changed a mind that had already been made up before it walked in the room. She's not wrong about the radiation tolerance, he muttered to the junior tech working the line beside him, a nervous kid named Priya who'd frozen mid-turn on her own wrench the second the princess's voice carried down. Keep working. Royalty doesn't fix coolant manifolds. That's still our job, and this line's not getting any less pressurized while we stand here listening. Doesn't it bother you? Priya asked, once the princess and her escorts had swept on down the corridor and out of earshot. The way she said it, like we're not even worth the effort of pretending otherwise. Bothered me plenty when I was your age, Dax said, checking the pressure gauge with a practiced eye. Took me a long time to figure out the only opinion that changes anything is the one you form about yourself. Somebody wants to think humans are fragile, let them. Doesn't cost me a thing, and it usually costs them a nasty surprise somewhere down the line. The inciting moment came 4 hours later, and it came without warning, which Dax would later reflect was the only mercy in the whole affair. Nobody had time to be afraid before they had to act, and afterward there'd be time enough for that particular feeling to catch up all at once. Kesh Station sat in a wide, slow orbit around a gas giant whose magnetosphere threw off unpredictable solar wind surges roughly twice a cycle, surges the station's shielding handled without incident 9 times out of 10. Routine enough that most of the crew had long since stopped paying the forecast bulletins much attention at all. The 10th time, the surge arrived 40 minutes ahead of every forecast the station's array had produced, hit the dignitary berth's exposed docking clamps at an angle nobody's models had accounted for, and sent a cascading power spike through the very conduit Dax had spent the morning working beneath. The Vashtir Royal cruiser's docking clamps failed first, snapping free of the berth in a shower of sparks that lit the whole bay in strobing white-blue flashes. Its main thrusters, still in standby cycle from the surge's initial jolt, fired asymmetrically for 6 catastrophic seconds before the onboard systems could compensate, shoving the entire vessel off its mooring and sending it drifting, listing, powerless, toward the gas giant's upper atmosphere, with the princess and 11 of her court still aboard, because nobody evacuates a docked royal cruiser in the 40 seconds between a surge alert and a hull separation. And the ceremonial protocols governing royal transport had never once accounted for an emergency this fast. Station alarms went up all at once, a wailing klaxon that cut through every deck simultaneously, the kind of sound that made Dax's whole body react before his mind had finished processing what it meant. He was still 30 feet below the berth, wrench in hand, coolant line half repaired, when he felt the whole structure shudder and looked up in time to see the cruiser's hull sliding free of its moorings above him, silent and terrible, already beginning its slow, inexorable drift toward atmosphere that would crush it long before it ever reached the gas giant's actual surface. Every rescue shuttle on the station's manifest was rated for vacuum work, not for a powerless multi-hundred-ton royal cruiser drifting toward a hostile atmosphere with a compromised hull and a fried navigation array. Station Command's own assessment, delivered over the general comm in the flat clipped tone people use when they already know the answer isn't good, gave the cruiser 11 minutes before atmospheric drag made any recovery attempt impossible, and perhaps 6 minutes of that before the ship's own failing life support put everyone aboard in serious danger regardless of what happened to the hull. There was no way to opt out of that math. 11 people, drifting toward a slow, ugly death, and every rescue protocol on the books built for scenarios this one didn't remotely resemble, because nobody had ever war-gamed a royal cruiser's clamps failing at exactly the wrong angle during exactly the wrong surge. Dax dropped his wrench and ran for the emergency EVA locker before command had even finished issuing the general alert. "You're not rated for this," Priya said, already 3 steps behind him and losing ground, as Dax hauled an EVA suit off the rack and started strapping in with the fast, practiced motions of a man who'd done this 100 times on a carrier that no longer existed. "That's a fleet rescue op, Dax. They'll scramble a proper crew." "There's no proper crew rated for a drifting royal cruiser with a fried nav array 50 seconds from atmospheric interface," Dax said, sealing his gloves, checking the suit's O2 readout with a glance he didn't need a full second for. "I spent 6 years running emergency recovery on the Halcyon before the review board decided that wasn't my job anymore. It's still the only thing I actually know how to do under pressure. Get me a tether line and open Bay 9's outer hatch. I'm not waiting on a scramble crew that won't reach that ship in time, not when I'm already standing in the right suit 2 decks from the right hatch." He didn't wait for her to argue further. The cruiser was already 40 meters off the station and dropping, its hull venting thin trails of atmosphere from a dozen stress fractures visible even from here, and every second spent arguing was a second that math didn't have to spare. Supervisor Reyes met him at the hatch, face pale, already halfway through composing an objection Dax could see forming before it left his mouth. "Calloway, you're not cleared for an EVA rescue op, station protocol says." "Station protocol didn't plan for this," Dax said, cinching the last strap. "You want to write me up for it after, go ahead. I'll sign whatever form you put in front of me. Right now I need that hatch open and a tether rig I can trust not to snap, and I need it in the next 90 seconds, or none of this is going to matter either way." Reyes held his gaze for one more second, then turned and hit the hatch release himself. The first beat of it nearly killed him before he'd even reached the cruiser. Kesh Station's maneuvering thrusters weren't built for chasing a drifting hulk through a solar surge's residual turbulence, and the tether sled Dax had jury-rigged from a maintenance, shuttle's cargo winch bucked hard enough on his approach that he lost his grip twice, tumbling in the dark with nothing but a fraying umbilical line between him and permanent, silent drift into the gas giant's magnetosphere. His pulse hammered loud enough in his own ears to drown out the calm chatter for a full 3 seconds before training reasserted itself, and his hands found the winch controls again on pure muscle memory. He caught the cruiser's outer hull on the 3rd attempt, magnetic boots slamming down hard enough to jar his bad knee through the suit's padding, and held on with both hands while the ship's own uncontrolled roll tried to fling him back off into open space, the whole hull bucking under him like something alive and dying at once. "Command, this is Calloway, I'm on the hull," he radioed, breathing hard, voice steadier than his hands. "Cutting into the secondary access hatch now. If I go quiet for more than 90 seconds, assume I'm venting and send someone smarter than me." "There is no one else out there, Calloway," Priya's voice came back, tight with fear she wasn't bothering to hide anymore. "You're it. The whole station's watching this feed. Just be careful." "Careful's a luxury," Dax said, already working the manual hatch release with fingers that fumbled once before finding purchase. "I'll settle for fast." Beat 2 came inside the ship itself, where the corridors ran dark except for emergency strip lighting, air thin and cold from a dozen hull breaches venting it steadily into vacuum, and the whole structure groaning under stresses its elegant Vashtir engineering had never once been designed to survive. Dax moved through it fast, favoring the bad knee, reading the ship's unfamiliar systems by instinct and the kind of pattern recognition that came from 2 decades spent learning that engineering, whatever species built it, always obeyed the same handful of underlying rules. Pressure sought equilibrium. Heat moved from more to less. Structure failed at its weakest joint first. Always, no matter whose hands had built it. He found the princess and her surviving court sealed into the aft compartment, air running thin. Two of her escorts already unconscious from a radiation dose the ship's failing shielding hadn't caught in time. Faces gone slack and pale in a way that told Dax exactly how little time this compartment actually had left. HFY Lydron looked up at him with an expression that had nothing left of the amusement from 4 hours earlier in it. "You," she said, voice hoarse from thin air. "The maintenance worker." "Dax Calloway. I need everyone conscious to help me get to the auxiliary power junction 2 decks down, or none of us are walking away from this. Can you move?" "I can move," she said, and there was no laughter in it now, none at all, only the flat focus of someone who had finally understood exactly how much danger she was in. "Good, then get anyone who can stand up moving toward the corridor I came in through. I'll carry whoever can't." He was already moving toward the 2 unconscious escorts, hauling the nearer one. Up over one shoulder, with a grunt that cost him something in his lower back, he chose not to think about yet. "We don't have time for anyone to wait their turn." Beat 3 was where the physical cost started stacking up in earnest. The junction Dax needed sat behind a bulkhead door fused shut by the same power surge that had ripped the cruiser free of its moorings. And with no cutting torch rated for Vashtir hull alloy in his kit, he did the only thing left to try. Braced both boots against the deck, wedged a salvaged support strut into the door's warped seam, and put his whole body into forcing a gap wide enough to squeeze through, tendons screaming, the strut biting hard enough into his palms through the suit's gloves that he felt something give in his left hand with a sharp, ugly pop he chose to ignore entirely, filing the pain away in the same mental drawer he'd used for 20 years of injuries that had to wait their turn behind whatever needed doing first. The gap opened 4 inches short of what he needed. He forced it the rest of the way with his shoulder, feeling ribs flex under the strain in a way that promised bruising he'd deal with later, if there was a later to deal with it in, sweat already soaking through the suit's inner lining despite the compartment's dropping temperature. "Your hand," Vasari said, watching him work, something new and unreadable moving behind her eyes, an expression Dax didn't have time to name and wouldn't have known what to call even if he had. "It is injured." "It'll keep." He squeezed through the gap, favoring the hand that wouldn't close properly anymore, already assessing the junction ahead with the fast triage instinct of a man who'd spent years learning to read a system's failure points in seconds. "Everybody through, quickly. Air's not getting any thicker in here, and I need at least 2 of you steady enough to help hold a line taut once I get this reroute started." Beat 4 cost him worse. The auxiliary junction, when he reached it, was live, not with enough charge to kill outright, but enough that manually rerouting power through a bypass conduit meant working with bare, unshielded fingers on a live circuit, because his suit's heavy gloves couldn't manage the fine motor work the reroute demanded. And every few seconds a stray arc bit into his skin with a sharp electric snap that left small, precise burns across both hands by the time he'd finished. He didn't stop. Stopping meant the reroute failed, and the reroute failing meant the cruiser's last reserve of thruster power stayed locked out of reach, while atmospheric drag did the rest of the work gravity had already started, and 11 people ran out of time somewhere in a dark compartment 2 decks up. "Almost there," he said, mostly to himself, teeth gritted against the burns, sweat stinging where it ran into a cut above one eyebrow he didn't remember taking. "Just need the secondary array to answer the override, and then we've got maybe 40 seconds of thrust to work with. Should be enough." "Should be," Vasari repeated, an edge of something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite disbelief in it, watching his ruined hands work the circuit with a fascination she plainly hadn't expected to feel. "You do not know that it will be enough." "No," Dax admitted, forcing the last connection home with fingers that were bleeding now in 3 separate places, the metallic smell of it sharp even through the suit's recycled air. I don't. But sitting here doing nothing gets you dead for certain, so I'll take the maybe. Where I come from, that's usually the only kind of odds anybody actually gets offered. Beat 5 was the ugliest one, and it was the one that finally made HFY understand exactly what she was watching. The reroute took, thrusters answering the override with a shuddering cough of power that bought the cruiser 40 precious seconds of controlled burn. But the ship's structural integrity, already compromised by the surge and the fall, couldn't hold that burn without the secondary bulkhead brace Dax had torn out of its housing 3 decks up to reach the junction in the first place. Without it, the ship would tear itself apart from the very thrust meant to save it, the whole vessel shuddering audibly around them as stress fractures already spreading through the hull threatened to widen into something catastrophic. There was no time to fabricate a replacement. There was time, barely, for one man to wedge himself bodily into the brace's empty housing and hold the load with nothing but his own weight and the flex strength of a body that had spent 20 years learning to absorb stress other people's engineering hadn't accounted for. Bracing both boots against the deck and both shoulders against opposing bulkheads, while the ship shuddered and groaned around him, and something in his already injured ribs gave way with a grinding crunch that put white static across his vision and stole the Bria. Clean out of him for a full second. Calloway, Priya's voice crackled over the comm, thin with static and fear. Your vitals just spiked. What's happening? Bracing the load, he ground out, voice tight with a pain he didn't have breath to properly voice, black spots creeping in at the edges of his vision that he blinked away through sheer refusal to let them win. Tell the pilot to hold that burn steady. Don't need it perfect, just need it held. He held it, for the full 40 seconds of burn, with cracked ribs and burned hands, and a knee that had long since stopped sending anything but pain signals. Dax Calloway held a failing bulkhead together with his own body, while a princess who'd laughed at human fragility 4 hours earlier watched him do it, close enough to see every flinch, every ragged breath, every moment his body clearly wanted to give out and didn't. She had moved, at some point in those 40 seconds without either of them noticing when, close enough to brace one shoulder against his, adding what little weight her own frame could offer to a load that was never really hers to help carry, because standing by and doing nothing had, in the space of one bad afternoon, become unbearable to her in a way it had never once been before. The burn ended, the cruiser's freefall arrested, its trajectory bending away from the gas giant's atmosphere and back, toward a slow, stable drift that Kesh Station's tugs could finally, safely reach. Dax slid down out of the brace housing and sat hard on the deck, blood running from both hands, breath coming in short wheezing pulls through what he was fairly sure were at least 2 more broken ribs than he'd started the day with, and didn't say anything heroic at all. Somebody get the tugs moving, he said instead, into a calm channel gone quiet with disbelief. And somebody tell my supervisor Bay 9's coolant line is still only half fixed, because I've got a feeling I'm not getting back to it today. Nobody laughed. Nobody, for once, seemed to think it was a joke at all. The turning point didn't come with words. It came 20 minutes later, once the tugs had matched the cruiser's drift and begun the slow work of hauling it back into a stable berth. Once Dax was sitting slumped against a bulkhead with a field medic finally getting to the burns on his hands, and Vasari K. Lydron crossed the compartment to kneel in front of him. An heir to the Vastir throne, kneeling on a scorched deck plate in front of a station maintenance worker, in full view of her own surviving court. None of whom moved to stop her, or so much as looked surprised that she would. She didn't speak first. She reached up and unclasped the ceremonial blade she wore at her hip, a slim curved thing worked in violet metal that Dax would later learn every Vastir royal carried from the moment they came of age and never, under any circumstance short of formal surrender, offered to another living hand. She held it out to him now, hilt first, both palms turned upward in a gesture that needed no translation. I said a human body is weak, she said quietly, none of the earlier amusement anywhere in her voice. I have spent this hour watching one hold a starship together through sheer refusal to let go. I do not know what to call that, Calloway. My people do not have a clean word for it. But I know it is not weakness, and I was wrong in front of my own court to have ever called it that. Keep the blade, Dax said, wincing as the medic pulled a splinter of hull metal out of his palm. I don't have anywhere to put it, and honestly, ma'am, I'm not big on ceremony. Just maybe don't laugh at the next maintenance crew you meet. Some of them are having a worse week than you'd think, even without a royal cruiser falling on it. She didn't lower the blade. Take it, she said, or I will kneel here until you do, and I am told royal stubbornness is a documented trait my own advisors complain about at some length. He took it, mostly because his ribs hurt too much to argue further, and the moment the hilt touched his burned palm, something in Th Vesari's posture eased, like a debt formally acknowledged instead of merely felt. Behind her, one of her surviving escorts, the elder of the two who'd remained conscious through the whole ordeal, inclined his head toward Dax in a gesture that clearly cost the stiff-backed soldier something to offer a human, and offered it anyway. The second complication surfaced 2 days later, while Dax was still confined to the station's medical bay against his own repeated protests that he had a coolant line to finish, and a supervisor who'd stopped even pretending to be angry about the whole affair, mostly out of what Dax suspected was sheer disbelief. A Vastir Systems investigator, sent aboard to determine the surge's cause, found something in the cruiser's damaged nav array that turned a freak accident into something considerably worse. A modified relay, deliberately installed weeks before the visit, timed to fail catastrophically the moment the station's next unpredictable solar surge gave it cover to do so. Someone had wanted the cruiser to fall. Someone had wanted it to look like an accident nobody could be blamed for, buried under the far more plausible explanation of an aging human station's imperfect shielding array. A rival faction within my own court, Th Vesari said grimly, standing at the foot of Dax's medical bed with the recovered relay in one gloved hand, turning it over like she could read the whole conspiracy in its wiring if she looked hard enough. My elder sibling supporters have opposed this trade summit from the start. If I had died in that fall, the summit collapses, and the opposing faction inherits the succession dispute on far more favorable terms, with a human station conveniently positioned to absorb whatever blame followed. It was meant to look like nothing more than bad luck and an aging shielding array, nothing my people would ever think to investigate closely enough to find this. And now, Dax asked, sitting up despite the medic's disapproving glare from across the bay, a glare he'd gotten very good at ignoring over the past 2 days. Now the relay exists as evidence, and the moment I bring it before the full court, the faction responsible loses everything, Th Vesari said. But they know that too. My systems investigator believes they will attempt to destroy the evidence, or silence those who recovered it before we can leave this station. We have perhaps 6 hours before the summit's closing ceremony, during which my ship's own automated defense grid, which the saboteurs clearly have some access to, given how cleanly that relay was installed without triggering a single standard diagnostic, remains a threat to everyone aboard, myself included, and to every delegate who will be gathered at that ceremony. You want a fistfight? That's not my department anymore, Dax said, already swinging his legs off the bed despite 2 separate protests from the medic. But if it's a systems problem, that's exactly my department. Get me back into that cruiser's core systems and let me see what they actually left behind. Sabotage always leaves a signature if you know where to look for it, same as any other kind of failure. Somebody built this thing to survive a casual inspection. Nobody builds anything to survive me going through it line by line with a grudge. The climax, when it came, wasn't a fight at all. Dax spent 4 of the remaining 6 hours buried in the cruiser's core systems, alongside the Vastir investigator, a meticulous, soft-spoken officer named Threll who clearly hadn't expected a human to keep pace with vastier engineering notation, but adjusted fast once it became obvious Dax wasn't going to need the concepts explained twice, tracing the modified relay's install signature back through the ship's automated defense grid until he found what he'd suspected from the start. A secondary dormant command, buried deep in the grid's targeting subroutine, set to activate during the closing ceremony and turn the cruiser's own point defense array against the summit platform itself, timed to detonate during the one moment every delegate from both factions would be gathered in the same room, a stroke of engineering as elegant as it was monstrous. They didn't just want her dead, Dax said grimly, staring at the code laid bare across the console, hands still bandaged, one finger tapping absently against the display as he traced the subroutine's logic. They wanted everyone dead, and the whole thing pinned on a station malfunction nobody could trace back to a person. Clean succession, clean deniability, and a human station taking the blame for the mess afterward, probably losing its trade charter over it too, which I'm guessing was a secondary benefit nobody minded. "Can it be disarmed?" Threll asked, leaning in over the display. "Not safely, not in the time we've got. Whoever built this wired the disarm sequence to double as a trigger if anybody without the right authorization code so much as touches it. Clever, honestly, means anybody who finds it and panics just sets it off early instead." Dax leaned back, thinking fast, the same way he'd thought fast 40 minutes into a rescue he'd never signed up for and pulled off anyway. But it doesn't have to be disarmed. It just has to be pointed somewhere it can't do any damage. That targeting subroutine pulls its firing solution from the ship's own position relative to the summit platform. Move the ship, and the firing solution moves with it. Get that cruiser undocked and drifting a half-kilometer off any inhabited structure before the ceremony starts, and whatever fires, fires into empty space, and everybody walks away none the wiser except us. "The ship's own thrusters are still offline from the surge damage," Threll said. "Full repairs are a week out at minimum. Our own engineers confirmed it morning. Don't need full repairs. Just need enough thrust to drift her off axis, and Kesh Station's got tugs rated for exactly that kind of job. I helped rig 2 of them myself back when I actually had a fleet posting, and I know their tow rigs better than the crews currently running them." Dax was already pulling himself up off the console stool, ribs screaming a protest he ignored, the same way he'd ignored every protest his body had raised over the past 2 days. "Get me back into Bay 9. I know those tugs better than anyone left on this station, and we've got maybe 90 minutes before that ceremony starts. I'll need Priya too, if she's willing. She's got a steadier hand on a splice than half the senior crew, whatever the roster says about seniority." It worked the way Dax's plans tended to work. Not cleanly, not without cost, but it worked. 2 station tugs, jury-rigged with tow cables. Dax spent the better part of an hour splicing himself despite hands still bandaged from the burns 2 days earlier. Priya working the second cable beside him with a focus that had nothing nervous left in it at all. Hauled the crippled Royal cruiser a full kilometer off the summit platform's axis before the closing ceremony's first formal words were even spoken. When the dormant targeting subroutine activated on schedule, exactly as Dax had predicted, its firing solution locked onto empty vacuum instead of a room full of delegates, discharging harmlessly into open space while alarms confirmed, moments later, that the sabotage attempt had failed entirely. The whole thing over and done before most of the delegates in that room had any idea how close they'd come to not walking out of it. The rival faction's involvement, once the failed attack's telemetry was cross-referenced against the relay's install logs, became impossible to deny in front of the full assembled court. HFY's succession claim, which had been contested and precarious before the summit began, emerged from the wreckage of the attempt on her life stronger than it had ever been, not because of any speech she gave, though she gave several, all of them shorter and more measured than her court apparently expected, but because every delegate in that room had watched, in the days prior, the recording of a human maintenance worker holding a bulkhead together with his own broken body to save her, and had drawn their own conclusions about what kind of ruler earned that sort of loyalty from someone with no obligation to give it at all. Dax missed most of the closing ceremony's aftermath, having excused himself the moment the immediate crisis passed to finally, properly finish Bay 9's coolant manifold, 3 days later than his supervisor had wanted and considerably more battered than he'd been when he'd started the job. He was elbow-deep in the reopened access panel, ribs still taped, hands still healing under fresh bandages, when T.H. Vasari found him there, ducking under the low-maintenance catwalk in a gown considerably less practical than anything the corridor had been built to accommodate, her two remaining escorts trailing behind her looking faintly bewildered by the whole excursion. "You are still working," she said, something between disbelief and reluctant admiration in it. "Coolant line's been open for 3 shifts too long as it is," Dax said, not looking up from the manifold. "Somebody's gotta finish it, and everybody else on this cruise rated for the easy sections, not the ones that spike. Figured I owed the line at least that much after making it wait through a starship rescue and an assassination plot. I offered you a formal position within my household guard," T.H. Vasari said. "An honored post, considerable compensation, a title that would follow you the rest of your life, and access to vast medical technology that could see that knee of yours fully repaired within a season, if you would only accept it. I told your steward I'd think about it." He finally looked up, wiping a smear of coolant gel off one bandaged hand. "No offense meant, but I've done the palace guard thing before, sort of back on the halcyon. Standing around looking important's never really been what I'm built for. I like fixing things. Turns out that includes falling starships when it has to, but mostly it's coolant lines and stuck bolts, and I've made my peace with that being enough, knee and all." "A human body is weak," T.H. Vasari said slowly, the words clearly costing her something to repeat now, turning them over like she was testing whether they still fit, the way you test a joint after an injury to see if it still bears weight the same way. "I said that the day I arrived on the station. I have never in my life been so thoroughly and so publicly wrong about anything, and my advisors have made certain I will not soon forget it." "You weren't entirely wrong," Dax said, going back to the manifold. "Bodies like mine break plenty easy, believe me, I've got the scar tissue and the medical bills to prove it. We're just stubborn about staying upright while it happens, and sometimes that's worth more than not breaking in the first place." He tightened the last coupling, checked the pressure gauge, and finally let himself exhale. "There, Bay 9's fixed. Only took me the better part of a week and one small starship rescue and a foiled assassination to get around to finishing it." T.H. Vasari watched him a moment longer, then did something that made even the 2 escorts flanking her visibly startle. She laughed again, the same light musical sound from 4 days earlier, but there was nothing dismissive in it this time at all. "Keep the blade sharp, Calloway," she said. "I intend to owe you further favors before this alliance is through, and I would rather you have something to show for all of them besides bruised ribs and unfinished coolant lines." "I'll keep it polished," Dax said, already reaching for the next stuck bolt on his list. "Mind the low catwalk on your way out. Gown like that wasn't built for maintenance decks, and I'd rather not have to explain to your steward how royalty tore a hem on my watch." She did come back, over the months that followed the summit's formal conclusion, more often than either the trade agreements or the diplomatic protocols strictly required. Sometimes it was legitimate business. The alliance the summit had produced generated no shortage of technical questions that somehow always seemed to root through Kesh Station's maintenance division rather than its diplomatic office. Questions Dax suspected didn't always need his specific input as badly as the paperwork implied. Sometimes it was nothing at all, just T.H. Vasari appearing in whatever bay Dax happened to be working, watching him fix things with the same quiet fascination she'd first shown him bleeding over a live circuit, asking occasional questions about systems she plainly already understood, as though the mechanics mattered less to her than watching a person work at something with his whole unglamorous attention. "You could ask your engineers to explain a coolant bypass," Dax said one afternoon, several months into this new arrangement, not looking up from the panel he was rewiring. "Vastur Court's got no shortage of people who could walk you through it faster than watching me do it by hand." "They could," Th. Vasari agreed, settling onto an overturned crate with the easy unself-consciousness of someone who'd stopped worrying, somewhere along the way, about whether a princess was meant to sit on maintenance deck crates. "But they would explain it as a diagram. You explain it like it matters whether it works, not merely whether it is correct. There is a difference, Calloway, and I find I have grown fond of the difference." Dax didn't have a ready answer for that, so he didn't try to give one and went back to the panel, and let the silence between them sit there comfortably instead of needing to be filled. Outside the clinic, no, outside the bay, Dax corrected himself once, catching the odd slip in his own thinking and deciding not to examine too closely why his mind had wandered there. The station hummed along in its ordinary orbit, coolant lines holding steady, reactor running cool for the first time in months, a trade alliance stronger for having nearly been destroyed by the very fragility it had once mocked. Somewhere in the station's lower decks, a child laughed at something entirely unrelated to any of it, ordinary and unremarkable and entirely unafraid. And Dax Calloway decided, not for the first time, that it was worth every cracked rib and every burned hand to have bought a little more of that particular sound of a life continuing on without incident. If a human holding a starship together with nothing but stubbornness and a bad set of ribs earned your like today, go ahead and tap it. Dax Calloway didn't do it for the credit, but you can still give it to him anyway. Subscribe if you want more of humanity's most unimpressive-looking heroes proving underestimated is just another word for underprepared for. And drop a comment telling me whether you think Th. Vasari ever actually collects that favor, or just keeps finding reasons to watch him fix bolts. Share this one with somebody who needs reminding that showing up broken and refusing to quit still counts as showing up.